This week, on DeadPhil Sunday, we'll be taking a look at a survey of people who were already factoring climate concerns into their reproductive choices. End quote. The survey found that 96% were very or extremely concerned about the well-being of their potential future children in a climate-changed world. End quote. The results point towards a large number of respondents fearing what their children, if they've had any at all given their climate concerns, might face in any apocalyptic future. Considering this, and using Lee Edelman's book No Future, we could easily argue that the future of our society, as we've come to know it, is at stake. We no longer feel assured of the existence of, what Edelman sees as, the futuristic fiction of the child. So this week, we're asking the opposite side of the knowledge production coin. Not how do we produce knowledge, but why, when faced with such an apocalyptic future, are we continuing to produce any at all? Edelman maintains that the child remains the perpetual horizon of every acknowledged politics, the phantasmatic beneficiary of every political intervention. End quote. By this he means that every political action taken to shore up the future is framed by the existence of this fictional future child. This survey is a great example of that, because the climate crisis and the apocalyptic future it poses is framed within this discourse of, but what about the children? Hence why Edelman remarks that we are no more able to conceive of a politics without a fantasy of the future than we are able to conceive of a future without the figure of the child. End quote. For the future always posits the existence of the child, and, as Edelman remarks, whose figurative status we are never permitted to acknowledge or address. End quote. Important to note, however, that in its coercive universalization, the image of the child is not to be confused with the lived experiences of any historical children, end quote. But rather it is a symbol, a fictional futuristic one at that, which serves to regulate the social order we exist within and seek to reproduce. This symbol of the child, then, is part of what Edelman calls the structuring optimism of politics to which the order of meaning commits us, installing as it does the perpetual hope of reaching meaning through signification, is always, I would argue, a negation of this primal constitutive and negative act. End quote. This negative act he speaks of is the non-participation in reproduction, and therefore in the futurity of society. Thus, this survey, you could argue, is in fact a hopeful response, for the endangerment of the child as a future fiction might foster a more rapid response, might engender society to respond to the alarm of its own possible demise. Furthermore, the research has found that 6% of parents confess to feeling some remorse about having children, end quote. Alternatively, this points to perhaps the retention of hope in the form of reproduction, for the majority of the parents in this survey at least. It perhaps points to that these parents, or in the cases that they didn't have children already, would-be parents, continue to hope for change, despite the apocalyptic alarm. On this subject of hope, I find any such argument as I've just outlined to be unconvincing. As Edelman remarks, politics then, in opposing itself to the negativity of such a drive, gives us history as the continuous staging of our dream of eventual self-realization, by endlessly reconstructing, in the mirror of desire, what we take to be reality itself. And it does so without letting us acknowledge that the future, to which it persistently appeals, marks the impossible place of an imaginary past exempt from the deferrals intrinsic to the operation of the signifying chain and projected ahead as the site at which being and meaning are joined as one. End quote. Firstly, the drive he speaks about is that want to not reproduce, to not participate in the futurity of society. Secondly, what he means by this quote is that the future to which we strive towards is constantly deferred. It is never realizable because the possible can never be actual. Once posited, the possible ceases to be possible anymore. The way in which we see reality, therefore, is in the context of this endless deferral, constantly striving for something else. The choice to reproduce can too be viewed in this context, as the road towards a future that is always coming, but never comes. At this point, we should turn back to the beginning and ask my original question again, which was, why, when faced with such an apocalyptic future, are we continuing to produce any knowledge at all? I argue that the production of all knowledge serves to cultivate an unreal future. It is used to construct the possibility that we might persist through time, through everything we face, climate crisis and all. I argue that continuing to produce knowledge in the face of abject oblivion is the ultimate comfort blanket. Continuing on whilst our world burns down around us tells us that things either aren't so bad or that things will be okay. After all, if we were in a burning building, everyone would be running, screaming, trying to get out, wouldn't they? I find that in the context of this reproductive futurity, as Edelman refers to it, we are bound to continue to produce knowledge. If we stopped, then it would be tantamount to the admission that we are doomed, that there's no hope. If such an admission were posited, then we would no longer need or want to play the societal game anymore. We would stop participating, which would surely seal, or at least trigger, the total destruction of everything we know. In short, the point of producing knowledge is much the same function as Edelman's futuristic fiction of the child. It poses the possibility of continuity, without which we would be unable to function. This marks the end of the 11th episode of DeadPhilSundays. We hope you enjoyed it, and that we'll see you again next week. Or given the apocalypse, maybe not.